webinar, 9/11, An Architect's Guide, a three-part series. Today's Thursday, August 29th, 2019. I'm Richard Gage, AIA, member of the American Institute of Architects and founder of Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth. We're a 501c3 nonprofit organization representing a growing body of now more than 3,000 architects and engineers signed on to the petition demanding a new investigation of the destruction of all three World Trade Center skyscrapers on 9/11. Last week, we presented part two, the Twin Towers' explosive destruction. This is part three, the Twin Towers in extreme heat, in which we'll be looking at the evidence of very high temperatures and incendiary chemical reactions involved in the destruction of these two skyscrapers. First, let me introduce you to our operations manager, Andy Steele. Hi, Andy.
Hello, Richard. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in today. I just want to let everyone know that I'm here to help with any technical glitches which occur from time to time. Also, we'll be happy to take your questions at the end of the course. Just submit them also in the questions and information form online at ae911truth.org. So with that said, back to you, Richard.
Thank you so much, Andy. And want to make sure that so people understand something about my background. I was responsible at the San Francisco Bay Area here in a local firm for the construction documents for these $3 and $10 million gymnasiums and the construction administration for this $125 million high school. More recently, before launching full-time onto this important outreach effort, I had similar responsibilities working on this $400 million mixed-use project near Las Vegas with 6 blocks of retail, mid-rise office space, and parking structure. Altogether, about 1,200 tons of fireproof steel framing. I now work full-time educating architects, engineers, and others to understand what really happened at the World Trade Center using the material in these courses. And to that end, we use the scientific method. It's been around for 100 years or so, and we have a specific way of going about winnowing error from truth, fact from fiction, when we have a question. What caused the Twin Towers to collapse? In this case, we do background research, make observations, construct a hypothesis. That's our best guess as to how these towers collapsed. Maybe the jet planes brought them down. Maybe the fires did. Maybe explosions did, and perhaps even controlled demolition. We'll examine these hypotheses, make predictions on them, test those predictions with experiments, analyze the results, draw conclusions. If the hypothesis is corroborated, we report the results in an open, transparent manner so all can build on the body of our work. We don't hide the input data, for instance, in the computer models used to prove our hypothesis, as NIST has done. When the hypothesis is not corroborated, we go back. We construct a new hypothesis. That's what we'll be doing today. If the hypothesis, until we do have one that is indeed corroborated by the evidence, the experimentation, the research. And regarding research, let's look at some of the forces that destroy buildings. Fire is certainly one of them. It's an organic process. Fire burns out an area in about 20 or 30 minutes, moves on looking for fresh new fuel sources. So when a fire causes a building to collapse, and never have we had a skyscraper collapse before 9/11 due to fire, but say a wood frame building, it's an organic process. It'll fall in stages. It'll fall over to the path of least resistance, not straight down through the intact cold hard structure below. And there's been some great tests that have been done. In this case, they built an 8-story building, steel framed building, some of which was fireproofed, some of which was not. The largest test of its kind in 1995 in the UK, loading up with all kinds of fuel, as you can see inside of this building. They really wanted to test the steel and see what would happen in the most severe case, creating 2,000-degree fires. And indeed, all that happens is the beams begin to sag. There's no failure of this building. Even with beams that are not fireproofed, all of our skyscrapers are fireproofed in the United States. And The test results that it's inherently stable due to the highly redundant nature of the structural steel form. So we have an incredibly important precedent for steel buildings not failing. This this test is more applicable to building 7, which we saw in the first week of or the second week of August, I believe it was, and which is online. You can look that up in YouTube, search for it. 9/11, An Architect's Guide to Building 7. So that's a precedent that applies particularly to Building 7. Why? Because Building 7 had these kinds of beams, although they were fireproofed. And the Twin Towers are different. We'll look at the structure of the Twin Towers in a moment. But other buildings have collapsed due to natural causes, in this case, earthquakes. The buildings fall over to the path of least resistance. The building's certainly damaged, but it's recognizable as a building. It doesn't collapse into its individual structural column and beam components, for instance. Some buildings are exploded, like these. We have thick, billowing, enormous pyroclastic like clouds created from the incredible heat from the chemical reactions of the explosives, creating cauliflower shaped forms that are rapidly expanding with a solidly defined edge. This is a very characteristic set of features formed only with great heat. We have chemical reactions that cause those, and witnesses see the results of those. They hear sounds of explosions and they see flashes of light. If you have these features, you know you have explosions. So keep this in mind. This is an important set of research that we can learn to expect what we would see in a gravitational collapse versus an a collapse by explosions or a collapse by fire. Um, so well, that reminds me, I will give you guys a slide that shows what we might see in terms of a collapse by fire in a wood frame building, which has happened. And that's real important. So I'll add that for you. Okay. Now we have you can bring buildings down with explosions by placing, as you see here, they place high energy explosives at key points of the columns and beams in the building, thousands of them. And we have a set of features that are associated with these types of collapses. There's only a handful of companies in the United States that can handle this type of work. It's extremely difficult, but it's a scientific process and results in a set of features that are commonly recognizable, such as a sudden onset of destruction near the base of the structure, usually, but not always. Straight down, nearly symmetrical collapse, depending on how they want to do it, sometimes into the building's footprint. How do you do that? By removing the columns uh, at once in the desired order, resulting in feature number 4, a free fall acceleration straight down through the path of what was the greatest resistance, the thousands of tons of structural steel in the case of steel buildings that are keeping that building up, that are 3 to 5 times stronger than they need to be to keep that building up. That has to disappear somehow. And it results in the total dismemberment of that structural steel frame. Feature number 6, limited damage to adjacent structures. One of the goals, certainly, of controlled demolitions. Feature 7, patterned explosions and flashes of light heard and seen by witnesses. Broken up concrete floors. You don't want to leave those floors there and have to jackhammer them up later at all odd and unsafe angles for the workmen to work at. Feature number 9, explosive charges visible at many of the floors. These are isolated explosive ejections called squibs in the demolition industry. Sometimes they're mistimed. Uh, Sometimes they go off early on purpose. but they're easily recognizable as an explosive. And there's chemical evidence of these explosive devices left behind in the residue. All this is direct evidence of destruction with explosives. Fire doesn't create these features. Fires cause structures to collapse asymmetrically with gradual deformations following the path of least resistance. So if we, for instance, these fires in the First Interstate building burning 3.5 hours over 5 floors, no collapse. Philadelphia, 18 hours over 8 floors, no collapse, because this is a steel framed, fireproofed set of buildings. Venezuela, 17 hours over 26 floors, no collapse. None before 9/11. Why? Well, the steel conducts that heat away very effectively from its heat source, original source, and it distributes it throughout this thousands of tons of heat sink, and it uh, it, it never the steel never gets to its 1200-degree temperature at which steel can uh, soften and begin to sag. It's a critical temperature, 1200 degrees. We have to keep the steel from getting to that temperature in any kind of a fire. So we put fireproofing on it. The 2-hour fire protection on the beams, 3 hours on the columns. So that keeps the steel from ever getting that hot. Uh, in the case of the Twin Towers, which we'll come to, the steel as the fireproofing was said to have been scraped off and or knocked off by the impacts of the airplane. And we're going to be looking at that in a moment. We also build these buildings out of non-combustible materials and keep tenants from bringing in loads of fuel that could make fire a real problem. And to keep fire from ever becoming a problem, we put it out before it even gets to be a problem with sprinklers. In the case of the Twin Towers, the sprinklers were said to have been disabled by the impacts of the airplanes and the explosion that occurred along with those. Uh, we also have additional circumstantial corroborative evidence that we can rely on for additional support for a proof of controlled demolition, such as government documentation. You don't just go out and bring a building down. You need approvals, typically. So we have foreknowledge of the destruction. We'll be looking at some of that. We looked at some of that last week in this webinar in part 2, which is on YouTube. You can look that up. 9/11 An Architect's Guide, part 2. It's on YouTube. Expert agree this is a controlled demolition. At least those experts without a financial or political obligation that might sway their objective opinion. So we look at the experts today. Video documentation, of course, can be very helpful in determining what. We'll be looking at. We looked at a lot of that yesterday, last week, and we'll look at more this week. This can all be proof of controlled demolition. With that in mind, let's focus that model on the Twin Towers as we proceed from last week, in which we saw feature number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. Um, so we saw these features all very clearly defined last week. Some very uncharacteristic features of controlled demolition too. And that was all direct evidence of destruction with explosives, not evidence of fire. Fires cause less robust structures to collapse, again asymmetrically, gradual deformations, path of least resistance. Today we'll be focusing on the extreme heat exhibited by the pyroclastic-like clouds that we'll have here. Let's look at the National Fire Protection Association guide, NFPA 921, Guide for Investigation of Fire and Explosions. It says, look for thermal effects. What's that mean? Large volumes of gas and the large amount of heat released in chemical explosions, causing rapidly expanding plumes of hot gases. Now, we certainly had that when the planes hit the towers, But we're talking about something else here. This is down in the pile after the buildings have collapsed. This is not about the airplane implosions. This is during the collapse also. We have rapidly expanding cauliflower-shaped plumes in all of the photos and videos, indicating extremely hot gases, which we're going to be looking at the source of today in a number of different ways, covering lower Manhattan. And I'm making a note here on a correction I have to make. But do we have extremely hot gases at the time of the collapse? No. Something else happened after this. At this time, just prior to the collapse, we have diminished fires and temperatures. The thick black smoke indicating oxygen-starved and cooler fires. So where did all that heat come from? It's got to be coming from something akin to this, and we'll be looking at such evidence as we move into the extreme heat and the evidence of molten steel and iron, particularly well highlighted by Massimo Mazzucco in his 5 DVD set 9/11 New Pearl Harbor.
Possibly the most important unexplained phenomenon at Ground Zero are the extremely high temperatures registered under the rubble for many weeks after the collapses. On September 16, NASA shot these thermographic images of Ground Zero, indicating unusually high temperatures at the base of the 3 collapsed buildings. Despite the heavy rains of September 14th, the hotspots registered peak temperatures of more than 1,300 degrees under the rubble. 10 days later, the fires kept burning.
What's to explain, Governor, the smoke that still comes out?
There's still fire down below. There is such an incredibly deep pile of rubble, and the tower goes down 5-6 stories underground.
But we had ABC crews come back just in the last few minutes and telling us there are still flames coming out of the base of the trade towers.
For the rescue workers, this became an additional burden on their already gruesome task.
Out still on the rubble, it's still, I believe, 1,100 degrees. The guy's boots just melt within a few hours.
On October 8th, the hotspots under the 3 collapsed buildings remained clearly visible. 6 weeks later, as the excavations progressed, the situation seemed only to get worse.
Oh, it's unbelievable. And this is 6 weeks later, almost 6 weeks later. And as we get closer to the center of this, it gets hotter and hotter. It's probably 1,500 degrees. We've had some small windows into what we thought was a core at some point, and it looked like an oven. You know, it was just roaring inside. And it was just a bright reddish orange color.
The consequences of such extreme temperatures were quite visible on the steel that was being extracted from the rubble.
Where the grapplers were pulling stuff out, big sections of iron that were literally on fire on the other end. They would hit the air and burst into flames, which was pretty spooky to see.
We would create an air pocket by moving steel, fueling the fires underground. But, you know, these underground fires are just like fires of hell.
If you could make a video of what you perceive hell to look like, from fire shooting up at times, that's what would happen. You would be in the middle of what would look like steel, and then fire just would pop up. Firemen were coming out with, and ironworkers with their boots literally melted. And then the hose would come over and they would try to put that part out.
I got there.
Charlie Vichers was a supervisor of removal operations at Ground Zero. From PBS's America Rebuilds page, we read, Vichers' crew picked up 40 to 60-foot long pieces of steel impaled in the pile, where the bottom 20 feet would be glowing red hot. Vichers said, trucks loaded with steel would pass by, and you could feel the back of your neck burning standing 20 feet away. In an article called A Dangerous Work Site, the U.S. Department of Labor wrote, underground fires burned at temperatures of 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. This was confirmed by Mayor Giuliani.
There were fires of 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit below the ground.
The Journal of the American Society of Safety Engineers wrote, thermal measurements taken by helicopter each day showed underground temperatures ranging from 400 to more than 2,800 degrees Fahrenheit. 8 weeks later, and the fires still had not subsided.
You see how this debris is still smoking? That's from the fires that are still burning.
8 weeks later, we still got fires burning. So, I mean, these things are burning. At one point, I think they were about 2,800 degrees.
11 weeks later, and the fires kept burning.
As recently as the end of November, it was still 1,100 degrees down underneath the rubble.
As November turned into December, ice was noticed in the mornings above the ground, but the debris underneath was still smoldering.
The weird thing was it was very cold when we were up there. I believe it was in the middle of the winter, but the ground wasn't frozen. The ground kind of like bubbled underneath your feet, which was kind of strange to me.
It took until December 19, more than 3 months after the collapses, for the last underground fire to be extinguished.
3 months. This is extraordinary. What were they saying during those 3 months? Red hot steel being pulled from deep within the pile, dripping from the molten steel, says this firefighter. Saw pools of literally molten steel, says the president of the cleanup company, Tully Construction. Seeing the molten steel, uncovering red hot metal beams, ranging from molten metal, which was still red hot weeks after the event. Molten steel at the heart of the tower's remains. Streams of molten metal that leaked from the hot cores and flowed down. Metal dripping from a beam. Molten steel beams to human remains. The end of the beam dripping molten steel. Mark Loiseau, president of Controlled Demolition, Inc., confirms molten steel was encountered primarily during excavation of debris. There are both videotape and photos of the molten steel being dipped out by the buckets of the excavators. A river of molten steel, a little river of steel flowing, says who? Leslie Robertson, the actual structural engineer of the company himself. Are these credible witnesses? His associate, Richard Garlock. The debris past the columns was red hot, molten, running. We see molten material flowing out of the South Tower. This says, well, in a frequently asked question, answered years later, but very frequently asked, this must be molten aluminum from an airplane. Nope. Molten aluminum looks silvery in daylight conditions. Doesn't glow yellow and orange like this. This is iron or steel, can only be liquid metal falling out of the crab claw excavator. At the New York Police Museum today, you can see molten concrete. Now, concrete doesn't melt until 3,200 degrees around the guns in the police area in Building 6. Molten concrete. I didn't even know concrete could melt. Fire temperature so intense that concrete melted like lava around everything in its path, including this handgun. Steel members in the debris pile that appeared to have been partly evaporated under extraordinarily high temperatures. I saw melting of girders at the World Trade Center, says one of the lead structural engineers investigating the debris, Abulhassan Astani Azal. Says if you remember the Salvador Dali paintings with clocks that are kind of melted, it's like that. It can only happen if you get steel yellow hot or white hot, perhaps around 2,000 degrees. But these fires weren't that hot. That's why we're talking about this. Let's go back to Massimo Mazzucca.
Another proof of extremely high temperatures reached during the collapse are the twisted and mangled steel beams found at ground zero.
Architects, engineers, people who work with steel, welders have just never seen the level of destruction and the level of deformation of this material in our lives.
You saw steel, some of the thickest steel I've ever seen, bent like a pretzel.
This 8-ton steel I-beam is 6 inches thick. It was selected to be preserved for future generations for the near-perfect horseshoe-like bend formed during the collapse.
I found it hard to believe that it actually bent because of the size of it and how there's no cracks in the iron. It bent without almost a single crack in it. It takes thousands of degrees to bend steel like this.
In fact, the temperature of 2,800 degrees mentioned before is not casual at all. as that's exactly the temperature at which steel melts.
Well, how do we get to temperatures at which steel melts? It's documented by FEMA in their report, which came out in 2002, in their Appendix C, a metallurgical examination of the steel. Let's look at it. A 1-inch column reduced to half-inch thickness, its edges curled like a paper scroll, thinned to almost razor sharpness. What happened to this steel? Not fire. Fire can't do this. Rapid oxidation, sulfidation, they describe, intergranular melting, liquid iron. Now that's molten iron. That's 2,800 degrees minimum. Sulfur formed during this hot corrosion attack on the steel. Where did the sulfur come from? No clear explanation for the source of sulfur has been identified. Well, this is called the deepest mystery uncovered in the investigation, yet it's completely ignored by NIST. And it's omitted in the final NIST report. The presence of sulfur, very clearly identified in this Appendix C of FEMA. Well, NIST took over the investigation throughout this Appendix C, and years later, acknowledged in their very frequently asked questions, sulfur present in the gypsum wall board was prevalent in interior protections. Wait, that can't be. Gypsum wall board contains inert calcium sulfate in its 100-year history of protecting steel. It has never turned around and attacked the steel that it's designed to protect. So this is a ludicrous speculation on the part of NIST to try to explain something that the official story cannot possibly explain. Experiments is what you do to see if inert calcium sulfate can turn around and attack the steel. You set a 2,000 degree fire. You put powdered gypsum in there and you see if it attacks the steel. But as you can see, no attack on the steel. That's why they use gypsum wallboard to protect it. Where was it coming from? It burned. The smell of sulfur, says this demolition worker. Well, let's see what NIST has to say about this phenomenon.
First of all, let's go back to your basic premise that there was a pool of molten steel. I know of absolutely nobody, and no eyewitness who said so, nobody who's produced it.
But witnesses testify otherwise.
Get down below and you'd see molten steel running down the channel rails, like you're in a foundry. Like lava from a volcano.
Actually melted beams where it was molten steel that was being dug out.
Underground, it was still so hot that molten metal dripped down the sides of a wall.
And the cleanup was very difficult in the beginning. Steel was coming out red in certain areas from the first couple of weeks.
This fused element of steel, molten steel.
And they pulled off a big block of concrete, and there was like a little river of steel flowing.
So Leslie Robertson confirmed a river of steel flowing once again. Here's John Gross, lead project engineer. You just heard from him. He's cutting off the very piece of steel that was sent to FEMA in the beginning to study for their Appendix C. They included this piece in Appendix C, and yet NIST says, gosh, we have no steel could be recovered. What molten iron are you talking about? So it's not jet fuel, because the spires are speculated by some supporters of the official story to be 1,200 degrees. NIST claims 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit. Even so, we're 3 times less than what's needed to melt steel. It's not the jet fuel. Jet fuel, according to its manufacturer, burns only 600 degrees in the open air. So, yet steel had definitely melted. As you can see here, we can tell by the material, molten metals, what the temperature is by the color. So we're exceeding 2,500 degrees here in the yellow and white portion down at the bottom. So where is this coming from? This incredible hot temperature. NIST says any molten steel in the wreckage was more likely due to the high temperature resulting from long exposure to combustion within the pile. What? Exposure to combustion? How do you get temperatures exceeding the capability? This is a closed system. There's a law. It's called the conservation of energy. Like fires burning under pulverized concrete powder in the basements of the World Trade Center, the amount of energy is fixed. You can't create any more energy inside the system. In other words, a fire can't get hotter than the capacity of the fuel that it's burning. You can only convert that energy you have from one form to another. In other words, the heat is dissipated. It doesn't increase. So we look at evidence for the potential cause of all of this heat. Forensic evidence. Thermite is a possibility. Could it have produced all that molten metal in those extreme temperatures? Well, what is thermite anyway?
An incendiary used by the military, thermite is a compound of iron oxide and aluminum, which when ignited sustains an extreme heat reaction, creating molten iron. In just 2 seconds, thermite can reach temperatures over 4,500 degrees Fahrenheit, quite enough to liquefy steel. We know that open-air fires cannot burn hot enough to melt steel, but metal had melted at the base of the towers. Appendix C of the FEMA report describes sulfur residues on the World Trade Center steel. The New York Times called this the deepest mystery of all. Sulfur slightly lowers the melting point of iron, and iron oxide and iron sulfide had formed on the surface of the structural steel. Sulfur used with thermite is called thermate, producing even faster results.
Maybe we're getting somewhere here because if thermite were used, it would explain the molten iron, not molten steel, but iron. By the way, we haven't used iron, elemental iron, in about 100 years in our skyscrapers. So this is elemental iron we're talking about. It's not coming from the steel. It would explain the presence of extreme heat because 4,000 degree temperatures are the byproduct of a thermite reaction. It would also explain the sulfur because sulfur is added to thermite to become thermate, much more effective at cutting through steel. None of these features can be explained in the official story. Let's go back to NFPA 921. It says, look for unusual residues that could arise from thermite, magnesium, or other pyrotechnic materials. The National Fire Protection Association is the authority on fire and explosion investigation. It's used not only in the United States, but throughout large parts of the world. So this says, well, we found no corroborating evidence to suggest that explosives were used. But when pressed a year later, they finally admit we didn't test for the presence of explosive residue. You can't find what you won't look for, but others looked for it and found it. It wasn't that hard to find. Here's Stephen Jones, physicist formerly from Brigham Young University. He says thermite reactions would produce a characteristic burn pattern, a white, yellow, hot liquid metal, like we see pouring out of the South Tower minutes prior to its collapse and throughout the piles, as you've seen already. A whitish cloud of aluminum oxide ash. What? As you see rising from the top of this material pouring out of the Twin Towers minutes prior to its collapse. And as you see trailing these thick white smoke clouds that are trailing these freely flying structural steel sections that we looked at last week, flying out at horizontally and at 45 degrees. Steel isn't flammable. It's not on fire unless there's something burning in and on the steel, such as a thermitic reaction. Does it even look like a gravitational collapse? Looks more like the volcanic eruption in the Tongan Sea in 2009. Upward, outward, arching streamers, freely flying solid objects trailed by thick white smoke clouds, indicating extreme heat on all these individually flying units. A geometry of fireworks. Does that look like a collapse? Both towers were nearly identical collapses, as you can see simultaneously. What else about thermite? It would leave behind a unique chemical evidence, such as iron, aluminum, copper, calcium, silicon, fairly common elements, but some unusual elements like fluorine and manganese left behind. These elements on the periodic table of the elements found in this small section of this 40-pound chunk called meteorites, fused molten metal. Well, some chips were sent to Stephen Jones, and he rules out aluminum from the jet planes because it's predominantly iron, previously molten iron. He says it has abundant manganese in this electron microprobe data analysis, so he rules out molten structural steel as a major component. It has aluminum, sulfur, potassium. So this is clearly the residue of thermite. What's that doing in the World Trade Center aftermath? Oh, it has manganese and fluorine in abundance. Manganese and fluorine? This is from potassium permanganate, commonly used as an oxidizer in thermite. Fluorine is used in sol-gel type thermite charges, very special ones. So this is all part of a thermite fingerprint. Sol-gels would leave behind a very special residue, though, 1,3-diphenylpropane. Interestingly enough, one molecule was present at levels that dwarfed all others, says Eric Schwartz. 1,3-diphenylpropane, we've never observed it in any other sampling we've ever done. It's not from plastics. It's not from computers. Even though they speculate that, gosh, what else could it be from? It must be from something like that. But they never found 1,3-diphenylpropane in office fires that have plenty of plastics and computers. He examines a piece of this steel sent to him by the sculpture at the International Peace Park in Manitoba. World Trade Center 7 steel in this case. X-ray fluorescence determines what? Iron, sulfur, potassium, manganese. This is another fingerprint of thermite, says Stephen Jones, physicist. Well, you can make thermite in your backyard and thermate as well. John Cole, civil engineer, did. You have to use a shaped cutter charge. You can't just pour this against the steel like the ridiculous National Geographic experiment on their program in which they tried to debunk conspiracy theorists. No, you have to put a shaped cutter charge. You can make it at home. Here it goes.
The web was reduced in thickness with gaping holes, thinned to almost razor sharpness, with a Swiss cheese appearance.
Where did I see that before? Oh, in the FEMA analysis of the steel from the Twin Towers in Appendix C, which NIST threw out when they took over the investigation. There are very highly efficient thermite-based cutter charges developed prior to 9/11, 2001, in which molten iron streams are issued in hundreds of milliseconds, cutting through much more thickness of steel, much greater thickness than is capable with shaped cutter charges of high energy explosives like C4 and RDX, which is why they might not have used them. They also might not have used traditional shaped cutter charges because those provide very loud bangs and very bright flashes. That audio and visual signature might have been a dead giveaway. So something a little more subtle seems to have been the order of the day here. This device uses consolidated consumable thermite as its casing. So there'd be nothing left in the pile except pools of molten iron, which we have plenty of. But what else did they find in the fine powder? So ubiquitous across 9/11 from river to river, a 3-inch thick pile, which is 30% concrete, as we looked at in last week's webinar. The U.S. Geological Survey does a particle atlas of dozens and dozens and dozens of different samples. And they always find the same thing, though. Previously molten iron microspheres, almost naked to the human eye, most of them. They're real small. Well, where do these come from? There's about almost 6% of some of these samples is composed of these previously molten iron microspheres. Scientists estimate up to 10 tons of this material by extrapolation. It's way more, 150 times more than the background iron particles that are in common office dust on the left. And they're spherical. They're not strangely shaped objects. These are very different. Something created these. R.J. Lee says they're formed during the event. This is an environmental consulting firm, also studying the dust independently. Oh, so we have molten iron microspheres formed during the event. This is very interesting. The EPA says there's so many of them, and they're so ubiquitous that it's used to distinguish World Trade Center dust from common office building dust. So it's not even World Trade Center dust unless it has these iron microspheres, which we don't know where they came from. Well, here's where they could have come from. This is a thermite experiment. Under controlled conditions, even right here, we have thousands and thousands of sparks. No, not sparks. Molten iron microspheres released and formed, released under pressure, aerosolized, if you will, and because of surface tension of liquids, it forms itself into a sphere. So could that explain the toasting of the tops of all of these cars in and around the World Trade Center immediately following the collapse of that building? What else could explain this? What else was found in the World Trade Center dust? A team of 8 scientists led by Niels Harrit and others documented 7 samples in a peer review, took 4 of them, like from the apartment of Jeanette McKinley across the street from the South Tower on Liberty Street. Her entire apartment was blown in, all of this dust that came through the broken windows. She collected it. She's an artist. It was part of her healing to do sculpture work with this dust. Unfortunately, it killed her. She died of brain cancer, ultimately. But one of these samples is hers. But they all contain these curious red-gray chips, red on one side, gray on the other. They're about a 1/16 of an inch long on average. And they thought they were paint. But this group got real curious because the chips are attracted to a magnet. Well, they zoom in to the red layer, getting real curious, and do X-ray energy dispersive spectroscopy. they find the same ingredients that's in thermite, iron and aluminum chiefly, but oxygen, silica, carbon. Why is there ingredients of thermite in the paint in the World Trade Center? We think it's paint because it's applied in a fluid fashion with a dual layer here. So they get real curious and zoom into the red layer 50,000 times with an electron microscope and find what? Nano-sized particles of iron oxide crystals and aluminum platelets. These are 1,000 times smaller than the diameter of a human hair. Very, very sophisticated material set in an organic bed of oxygen, silica, carbon. Organic material provides the gas expansion in TNT. It's used to knock things over. So here you have incendiary materials, iron oxide and aluminum, combined with an expansion. So you have an incendiary designed to be more explosive, as we'll see. So small amounts of this have been published by Los Alamos Laboratory, who developed this along with Lawrence Livermore Laboratory, this super thermite, they call it, at about 420 degrees centigrade, 758 Celsius, Fahrenheit. They ignite, producing what? Well, these chips did the same thing. They ignite at 420 degrees, all of the chips, and produce these molten iron microspheres that you see here. So why are we having the same spheres with the same or very, very similar, same enough chemical signature produced from these tests of these chips that are found by the U.S. Geological Survey in their studies, spheres extracted from the dust. So it's pretty extraordinary similarity, meaning that we know where those spheres came from. They came from these chips. So we have an internally consistent, self-corroborating set of repeatable forensic evidence, data that can be used to prove in a court of law what brought these towers down, along with this other evidence we're talking about. If we can get it into a court of law, and we can put the perpetrators, the real perpetrators of the destruction of these three towers away for a long, long time. As if we didn't know where these spheres came from, they're found attached to these partially ignited red-gray chips, as you see here and here. This is developed by Lawrence Livermore Lab. You see when you bring, with nanotechnology, you bring the surface volume, the size of these elements infinitesimally small, the surface area of them increases exponentially. So you've engineered an incendiary to become much more explosive. It's not made in a cave in Afghanistan. This is an extremely sophisticated process made only in the most advanced defense contracting laboratories. So we need a real investigation. This is all peer-reviewed in a paper, by the way, by the Bentham Open Chemical Physics Journal, concluding that the red layer is unreacted thermitic material incorporating nanotechnology, highly energetic pyrotechnic or explosive. So I encourage you to read that. Just Google active thermitic materials. And this is all direct evidence of explosive destruction. Yet again, this week, as we look at extreme heat, we have more direct evidence of explosives with destruction with explosives and incendiaries, particularly incendiaries this week. No evidence of destruction from fires, especially these fires, not going to be producing all this heat. right? Thick black smoke, oxygen starved, cooler fires. In fact, we have the release of from the FOIA request of the thermal imaging videos that show what? Show relatively cool fires. In this case, only 100. What are we showing? About 200 degrees Fahrenheit on average. Maybe they got up to 500 or 600 degrees. No hotter than that. This is a hot fire. This is World Trade Center 5. If any of these World Trade Center buildings were going to collapse due to fire, we'd expect it to be this one. Did it collapse? No. No collapse. Not with steel frame high-rise and mid-rise fires. I mean, buildings. No collapse. What about the testimony of the first responders? We looked at that last week. Data from the FEMA and NIST reports. Let's go to that. 2002, FEMA produced with $600,000 a report, but their efforts were hampered, citing by the New York Times documenting this. Blueprints of the buildings, couldn't get access to them. Bureaucratic restrictions keeping them from interviewing witnesses, making forensic inspections at the site, getting crucial information, letting them appeal to the public for photographs and videos. That wasn't an investigation, which concluded, by the way, Fire Engineering has good reason to believe, well, that what prompted Bill Manning, editor-in-chief of Fire Engineering magazine, to cry out. They have good reason to believe that official investigation blessed by FEMA is a half-baked farce that may have already been commandeered by political forces whose primary interest, to put it mildly, lie far afield of full disclosure. The structural damage from the planes and the explosive ignition of jet fuel in themselves were not enough to bring down the towers. That alone is reason enough for a new investigation, that assessment from our fire protection engineers. 2005, NIST comes out with their report, starting with the assessment that these buildings came down by fires. They weren't looking for an independent conclusion. They're just trying to justify the fire and airplane impact collapse theories. They had $20 million of funding. Now they're part of the executive branch of the US government. Their leadership was changed by the Bush administration when they came into power. Let's look at the report. Their objectives given to them by Congress to determine why and how World Trade Center 1 and 2 collapsed. But there's a problem. They have their own agenda, and it's hidden in footnote 13 on page 82. Check it out. The focus of the investigation was on the sequence of events from the instant of aircraft impact to the initiation of collapse. What? It doesn't actually include the structural behavior of the tower after the conditions for collapse initiation were reached. Wait a minute. You were tasked by Congress to explain the collapse, not the initiation of collapse. You had 10,000 pages, 1,000 pages modeling the airplanes, 100 pages of fire modeling and life safety issues, only a half a page on the actual collapse. Well, what does it say? The structure below the level of collapse initiation offered minimal resistance. The large building mass far exceeded the capacity of the intact structure below to absorb it. Came down essentially in free fall. Floors below were unable to arrest the moving mass. Wait a minute. That is pure speculation. There's no analysis with supporting calculations whatsoever. The task that Congress gave you, you failed at. Should have been called the final report on the initiation of collapse. This is a travesty. Then they cast doubt on their own collapse theory because we write them, which you can do with governmental reports. You can, according to the Data Quality Act, you can provide a request for correction. They write back, we were unable to provide a full explanation of the total collapse. You were unable to provide any explanation or any analysis, really, at all. You didn't. You failed. F. What do the experts say? At least those experts that aren't tied to financial or political obligations, which might sway their objective opinion. Like in this case, we have an independent opinion. Ron Brookman, structural engineer, doesn't look anything like a heat-induced gravitational collapse mechanism. Why did the complete collapse of the towers somehow become inevitable? Why would all 110 stories drop straight down to the ground in 10 seconds, pulverizing the contents to dust and twisted steel? Ed Muniak, fire protection engineers. The fires were weak. NIST reports that they confirm the steel temperatures were low. World Trade Center collapses have no resemblance to any previous high-rise fire. And there's many more, but we're running out of time. What about the evidence? Surely in the most historic collapse of all time, the most extraordinary and historic, we've got the evidence preserved so investigators could look at the steel and examine it. Well, let's listen to one of these investigators.
After 9/11, we realized that Port Authority of New York and New Jersey has sent all the steel that we need to study. That's why I'm here to study steel. Has sent all the steel to recycling plant to go to China for recycling. For what? For 15 cents a pound. Just nothing. And all the evidence of steel went to melting pot.
After 9/11, a law was passed requiring that such materials be saved for study.
Too little, too late. All the evidence of the steel went to the melting pot, he says, for China for recycling. He was one of the main forensic investigators with a grant from the National Science Foundation. Well, what does Bill Manning say, editor-in-chief of Fire Engineering Magazine? Crucial evidence that can answer many questions. It's on the slow boat to China, showing an astounding ignorance of government officials to the value of a thorough scientific investigation. The destruction and removal of evidence must stop immediately. But it didn't. It was put on barges, sent to China, 400 truckloads a day, easily the largest and most perplexing structural failures in history. And yet it was just destroyed. This is the illegal destruction of evidence in a crime scene, prompting so many to come to the conclusion through the scientific method that controlled demolition is the actual cause of the collapse of these towers. Today we showed features 8, 9, and 10 of controlled demolition. Some very unusual features too. Last week we showed features 1 through 7. Altogether, direct evidence of destruction with explosives. Fire doesn't explain these features. With additional circumstantial corroborating evidence, this is proof of controlled demolition. And at this point, Andy will help you in giving us a way to ask your questions, so we might be able to answer them today for you. Andy.
Thanks, Richard. Okay, please submit your questions that you might have in the same input form mentioned earlier, and we'll do our best to answer them. In the meantime, we'll tell you about some of the ways that you can get involved if, now that you're informed, you agree that this evidence is quite compelling and warrants a new investigation.
Great. That is fantastic. And before we get to those, while you're writing them and sending them in, encourage you also to subscribe with your email address. That way you can find out what kind of efforts we're making toward a real investigation. And you can support us in different ways. You can, learn what the latest evidence is. So get informed on our website. The evidence section up above is extraordinary. It has lots and lots of information for you. We want to encourage you to sign our petition. Join the 3,000 architects and engineers demanding a new investigation. Even if you're not an architect or engineer, we have more than 20,000 others supporting these brave professionals who are risking their reputation to sign this public petition. And donate to our work. We are all around the country at conferences, engineering and architecture conferences, trying to wake up that profession. We're always sending information to the media, making great strides, and we encourage you to support the work because, especially this year at this time, we have a huge September 11th coming up. We are going to be hearing from the uh, two of the five fire commissioners who have demanded a new investigation. Their entire fire commissioner board unanimously is calling for a new 9/11 investigation. This is absolutely historic. They'll be speaking in New York with us on September 7th, Saturday at 3 p.m. They'll be going to uh, the National Press Club in Washington, D.C. with us to present their case before the American people in a major press conference, which they'll be joined by Bob McIlvaine, which we'll hear about a little more later, family member, and Helen, his wife, and myself will be there to highlight the evidence. And we'll also be joined by the Lawyers Committee for 9/11 Inquiry, who will be talking about the latest updates on the legal issues, such as the U.S. grand jury petition. Anyway, all that requires enormous quantities of support from you. So become a member of AE 9/11 Truth. Join the family of sustaining members. You can give as little as $5 a month, or $25 a month, or $100 a month, or more. And that puts you in tight working relationship with us. For those that are giving $50 a month, we have a quarterly conference, which we still need to set up for this year. And we will do that. And look forward to talking to you all about these activities of September 11th at that conference, private conference meeting. And volunteer with us. Andy, what kinds of opportunities are there?
Well, there's plenty of them, and all of this work that's going to be done here on the anniversary is not possible without the hard work of volunteers that have been putting in a lot of hours throughout this year just to get us to this point. And we have so many people right now who are helping us to help other supporters get those meetings scheduled. I couldn't be doing this work without that help. And people who have found engineering professors to send our materials to send our World Trade Center 7 study information about it to. Lots of things that you can do. And it doesn't just end on September 11th because this work goes on all of the time. So if you're willing to put in a few hours of work each week, that's all that it takes. Then all you have to do is go to ae911truth.org. There's a very short application you fill out. You do that and we'll get in touch with you, see where you'll best fit, and you can be a part of something big by doing that. So I recommend anybody who's got energy behind this issue, I know there's a lot of people that do, then seek out some way to help through volunteering with us.
Great. And so many things you can do. I mean, look at these people. They're just delighted to be supporting the effort to bring about a new investigation through Congress, if possible, or through the American people, the force of will, by joining us on all of these great teams that we have. You can take more effort on your own. Contact your elected representatives, television, radio, newspaper. Tell everyone you know. Screen the AE 9/11 Truth DVDs. Share them in the brochures. One-on-one. They're in our store. You can buy 50 of them for like less than $10. And join the effort, which is imminently coming out, the release of the World Trade Center 7 study. September 3rd, it will be released in Alaska online. You can download it, look at it. Professor Hulsey will be presenting a live-streamed presentation at the University of Alaska in Fairbanks. He'll then go down to Berkeley on September 5th and present at 5 p.m. I think it's 5 p.m. Check our schedule online. Our our September 11th event schedule should be right at the top in the top slide banner. And we have a ways to go to actually pay for this. They're releasing it. It's not yet paid for, so we've got to pony up, folks. Support us with this effort, because what has he done? He's proven already beyond a shadow of a doubt that this building did not come down due to fire. That's the conclusion. It's not a surprise. There's a surprise at the end, though, because in our 1-minute video, which we're producing for you, which we want you to send viral, it's not ready yet, but on social media, he will take Building 7's computer model that they have created after having removed all eight floors of columns. It falls exactly like the video that you've seen all over the place in the 9/11 Truth Movement on our website. You can see it. So, as opposed to NIST's video, which can't even mimic the building because even in their effort to manipulate their data, releasing 400 structural steel sections per second in their computer model, they can't even provide a model that that falls. It actually begins to tip over. It doesn't fall straight down like the video, and it looks nothing like the actual collapse in the video. And that's why so many of us are going to Congress with the fire commissioners on September 11th in the afternoon, and we want you to join us if you're in town. What are we going to do, Andy?
Well, we are going to be in Washington, D.C. We're going to be meeting with members of Congress. We've already got a lot of meetings set up. We want more, though. We want to stay really busy on that day and in the days that followed. In fact, I just confirmed another one, Richard, while the webinar was going on.
Yay.
So this is exciting, and it's all going to be centered around this. The Bobby McIlvaine World Trade Center Investigation Act. This is the path to justice for the nearly 3,000 victims who died on that day. One of them was Bobby McIlvaine. He was killed by an explosion as he was entering the North Tower. So we know that there's not explosions killing people as they enter the lobby in the official story. So right by the nature of how he died, we have questions to the story that we've been given. His father, Bob, has just been outspoken on this issue for a number of years. He's stood with us, and he's going to be going with us down to D.C. in these meetings. And what this would do is this would establish a select committee. It can be passed in either house of Congress that'll do exactly what we've been asking members of Congress to do for since the beginning of AE 9/11 Truth. That's reinvestigate the destruction of these 3 buildings. It's actually written in such a way that they have to look into the case that Richard is presenting here. So that's the beauty of it. You can learn more about it by going to ae911truth.org/justice. And it has all the information on the bill. You can download materials to hand to your member of Congress if they're in town doing town halls. You can also generate a letter automatically. Even if you don't feel like writing an email, it will do it for you. The computer will. And all you got to do is put your address in. It'll send it to your representatives just with a few button clicks. And you can also text 911 Justice to 797979. Because every once in a while, we like to mobilize people and send out instructions on how you can help out with a very quick action. So it's really cool to be on that list and be part of those mass actions. So that's what it's about. And to get this thing passed, we just got to keep on pushing and letting them know that this bill exists. And I have no doubt with the weight of everything else Richard has mentioned here in this post-webinar time today, I think we are going to get this passed at some point because they can't just ignore this anymore.
Excellent. We're just it's going to take the kind of work we've been doing, and we have 2 huge cannonballs. Here's one of them: a grand jury investigation. The U.S. attorney has agreed to comply with the law, which requires him to impanel a special grand jury to investigate this evidence that's included in a petition submitted by the Lawyers Committee for 9/11 inquiry. We're very excited about this. And the Lawyers Committee are following up with a special submission, which will force them to actually act. So we're very proud of this work that we're doing with these attorneys. And we've also submitted a lawsuit against the FBI, forcing them to release the information which they were required to assess and include in the 2015 9/11 Review Commission, meaning all of the evidence that the FBI has become aware of since the 9/11 report came out. They didn't include the explosive evidence in the DVD which we gave them, which they said, gosh, this is backed by thorough research and analysis. But they didn't tell that to the Congress, and nor did they tell them about the nanothermite paper, which they also reviewed and commented on, not so favorably in that case. Either way, they're forced to release this information. This lawsuit will force them to do just that. And we have included this evidence in a very special landmark documentary, which we would like you to see a few minutes of so that you can go to YouTube, watch it for free, or buy the DVD from our store. Here's just a taste.
I don't want to be involved in conspiracy theories. There are lots of them. They can go on. We can speculate on that forever. What we really need to know is how those buildings came down.
World Trade Center 7 collapsed because of fires fueled by office furnishings. It did not collapse from explosives or from fuel oil fires.
To undermine scientific integrity is to undermine our democracy.
This is what NIST has done, denied and ignored crucial evidence.
The American people absolutely need the truth of 9/11.
More than 1,500 architects and engineers and 12,000 others, including many scientists, have signed the petition calling for a scientific investigation of the destruction of the Twin Towers and World Trade Center Building 7. The report, issued by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, referred to as NIST, was not valid science.
They're talking about a single columnar collapse or failure that resulted in a total collapse of the building.
Building number 7 descended in free fall for the first 100 feet, which means that there was absolutely no resistance to descent whatsoever.
So all of the columns really needed to be severed at the same time.
The symmetry is the smoking gun.
NIST has admitted it went into free fall for 8 stories.
You don't need to be an engineer or an architect to see what happened to those buildings.
Dit is controlled demolition. Zeker weten. Zeker weten.
What I saw, it was a classic implosion. The center of the core, the penthouse area, starts to move first, and then the building follows along with it.
NIST excluded the documents from FEMA in Appendix C that documented the evidence of melting steel.
In an office fire, you cannot generate enough heat to melt steel.
There were these iron microspheres present in all of the dust samples. They needed to have been formed in extremely high temperatures.
All the characteristics of the microspheres, along with what I see in the attack of the beams that were actually found, tell me that thermite was involved.
In the dust, what we have found is a modern version of thermite, which we call nanothermite.
NIST concedes that they found no evidence for explosives. So then we asked them, well, did you look? And they said, no, we did not look for explosives or residues of explosives.
And in fact, the evidence is overwhelming that these red-grade crystals are very high-temperature incendiaries.
And we have watched as scientific integrity has been undermined and scientific research politicized in an effort to advance predetermined ideological agendas.
If this is a crime, I think everybody agrees it's a crime. Evidence was removed from the scene of the crime. You can't do science when you are deprived of the evidence and when your hypothesis is the least valid instead of the most likely. When the most likely hypothesis in the case of Building 7 wasn't even mentioned. This is not science.
Yeah. Powerful video. Watch the whole thing. It's free on YouTube. You can get the video in our store also. And this 50-page booklet you can download from our website for free, or you can buy a hard copy in our store. It's quite well done. Tears the floor out from underneath the NIST report for both Building 7 and the Twin Towers, provides the evidence, most of which you've seen here on these webinar series. This 2-hour presentation by me, it consolidates these webinars into 2 hours. And it's also on YouTube. And the 15-minute documentary just on Building 7, made for PBS, very high quality, narrated by Ed Asner. Encourage you to get that. It's also free on YouTube, but you can get the DVD. Yeah, I think we might have some questions. Is that true, Andy?
Yeah, we got 5 of them today. Now, one actually got submitted in the comments, and we want to make sure it gets heard because it's an important one. So let's do that first so I don't overlook it. It says, is a federal grand jury really going to hear evidence for explosives being used on 9/11? You want to address that?
Yeah, great question. So they spent a year putting this petition together with 60 or so counts of evidence, which they've taken from our work over the last 12 years, consolidated it, and they're required, the U.S. Attorney is required by law to impanel a special grand jury. So if they do obey the law, then they have to give the petition at the very minimum to the 23 jurors. When they see this, they're going to have all kinds of questions, and we have expert testimony ready to go, and we've let them know that. So we expect to be called as expert witnesses. How long will that take? We don't know. What evidence do we have that it's done so far? Because this has been a while now, months and months. We have no evidence that it's underway. There was a conversation between the U.S. Attorney's representative and the Lawyers Committee, and they weren't able to disclose what, if anything, has been done yet. So they're going to be submitting special, what is it?
Mandamus.
Yeah, but it's in the form of not a petition, not an amendment, but it's got a legal name. Anyway, it may be a mandamus action, and that's what we're expecting. That'll be released and announced on September 11th at the National Press Club by the Lawyers Committee, and probably before that in New York. So encourage everybody to come. But that's as much as we know about that. So meantime, we keep rolling. We've got the fire commissioners. We've got the first legislative body in history to demand a new investigation. Very exciting. Not a legislative body, but an elected body. And the Halsey study, which is an extraordinary opportunity to reach out to the engineering committee. We want to send 20,000 postcards to engineers all across the country, and we need your help to do just that. So please donate on our website and support that effort. For $15, you can send that report to 10 engineers, and you get a card yourself as well. Anything else on that one, Andy?
No, the lawyers from the Lawyers Committee for 9/11 Inquiry have been on my show and discussed this issue, so you can look in on the internet and find that pretty easily. You can just Google my name, Andy Steele, along with Mick Harrison, and I'm sure it will come up for you, so you can hear that in more detail. And they are the lawyers, we are not. They should be able to fill you in even further on what's going on with it. Even though we know they'll be able to get into more technicalities with it. So what does fall within our area of focus here are the remaining questions. The first one asks, on the one hand, NIST said that they talked to many eyewitnesses, walked the steel yards, and saw that there was zero evidence of any molten steel. But on the other hand, NIST said if there was any molten steel evidence, then you would have to assume that it melted after the collapse because the fires wouldn't have been hot enough to melt any steel when the towers were still standing. Why did NIST second guess themselves?
Well, they were boxed into a corner. So here's evidence of molten steel, which can't be denied, although they denied it early on, as you saw from John Gross. And it wasn't included in their final report. So it's kind of disingenuous, at the least, to say, well, if there was molten steel, it would have been down after the collapse. Well, why not during the collapse? After all, it's during the collapse that we see these incredibly hot clouds of expanding cauliflower-shaped forms produced by what? The few small fires that were probably automatically extinguished at the initiation of collapse. I mean, there's no way those fires can exist under those conditions. Something else is going on, which we've seen evidence over the last 2 hours to support thermite incendiaries. I noticed, Andy, there's one more question in the comments. It says, is the booklet translated into French? And yes, I believe Beyond Misinformation booklet is translated into French. And for those of you who are looking for other French or other translated languages, you can find them in our international section on our website. All kinds of languages these materials are translated into.
That's right. We got a hardworking translation team and a hardworking volunteer that leads that to make sure these things are available worldwide. The next question asks, are there any records of first responders being treated for burns from accidentally touching the red hot steel?
Good question. I actually don't know. I haven't examined the medical stuff very much. Some people have been focusing, though, on the nanocarbon tubes found in the lungs of the first responders. Nanocarbon tubes are created by nanothermite. And Niels Harrit actually did a portion of his presentation on this very subject in Toronto at the event called the Toronto Hearings, which is out on a DVD called, what's that DVD called, Andy? We have it in the store. Decade of Deception.
Right.
Yeah. 9/11 Decade of Deception, something like that. So learn more about that from Niels Harrit.
All right. And that is a very good question, actually. We should look into that. The next question asks, I heard that there was evidence of glass being vaporized by heat. If true, what temperatures are required to vaporize glass?
Well, good question. I didn't know glass was vaporized. I do know that lead was vaporized. And I do know that lead takes 5,000 degrees temperatures to vaporize. Because this lead vaporized and then reformed, condensed onto the mineral wool insulation used as fireproofing between floors. They stuff it between floors. And this was found by, that was in the, I believe that was very documented by USGS in their particle atlas. So how do you get vaporized lead condensing on mineral wool fibers that takes 5,000 degrees to vaporize lead? That's just extraordinary. So I don't know how to answer that question.
Right. And, if somebody sees a fact out there listed somewhere and we've never heard it before and you ask us and we say that, then feel free to send it in to us, the source, the original source, because we got to vet it, of course. But you can send it into info@ae911truth.org and we'll take a look at it. Last question. Does RJ Lee have any political reasons to say nothing about finding the red gray chips?
They've been inquired to explain because they first of all, regarding the chips, which is the question, RJ Lee has not commented. Do they have any political reasons why they haven't commented? I don't know. I can't speculate on that. But they have been asked specifically about the molten iron microspheres, which they've documented and which they have said were formed during the event. Well, how were 10,000 tons of previously molten iron microspheres formed during the event? That's an extraordinary question that has not been asked of them, but they did answer some other questions provided by Chris Sarnes, and he's got that communication. I don't remember what it is, frankly. It wasn't strong enough to actually put inside the PowerPoint. I see one more question here from our comments. This will have to be the last one because I gotta go, and Andy's got a whole lot of work to catch up on. We're preparing for our September 11th activities. So last question here. Have a large number of fire, police, sheriff departments, commissions, governmental bodies been apprised of the historic resolution action taken by the New York City Area Fire Commissioner? Well, there's commission. The 5 commissioners in this commission have voted unanimously for a new 9/11 investigation. They are going with us on September 11th to the National Press Club. We will take the video from that National Press Club event, which will be live streamed, by the way, on our website, AE 9/11 Truth. We will get it to all of the fire commissioners starting in New York. They're very, very on fire, no pun intended, to get this story, not story, but the truth about 9/11 out to the other fire commissioners. These guys are going to town. So very excited about helping them with that opportunity, of course. And they need your support too. If you Google Franklin Square Fire District and send them a letter, maybe there's a contact us on their website, telling them how impressed you are with the stand for truth that they've taken, risking their reputations and disrupting their lives as it has, because they're getting all kinds of flack for this. They need support at the station, the district station there. So please do that. I think that's all the questions, Andy. Is that true?
That's it. So I guess we will see them next month.
Yeah, and what we talked about this week is part 3, Twin Towers and Extreme Heat. And we looked at the high-rise fires, the pyroclastic clouds, molten steel and iron microspheres, thermite, nanothermite. All that is direct evidence of explosive destruction, incendiary destruction, actually, in part 3 here. Last week we looked at part 2, and next month we start all over again with part 1. Actually, not true. September, we're so busy, we're taking the webinars offline. You can feel free to look at the ones we have there, but we'll come back in October, the first Thursday of October, with part 1, World Trade Center Building 7, at 1 o'clock Pacific. Until then, I'd like to thank everybody for joining us and Andy for helping us out so much. And we'll see you all next in October. Bye for now.